So there's an acceptance that this war has been lost, and this begs also the question: what are the calculations coming from Washington, and what kind of policy changes will there be? Because the message you get from the Trump administration is, the war has been lost more or less. The Ukrainians might lose their entire country if they continue. Again, they're on the path to collapse. And also the conflict with Russia doesn't make much sense, because at the moment, all it did was push Russia. Instead of, the Biden wanted to break Russia so they could focus on China. Instead, it's Russia's only strengthening, and it's aligning itself closer and closer to China. This is, Kissinger's worst nightmare. You don't want this. You want to have a natural balance of dependence or balance of power on this vast Eurasian continent. So instead, they're seeing all the major powers beginning to cooperate to balance the United States, and this is not ideal for the US.
Glen Diesen, good afternoon to you. How are you, my friend?
Oh, very good. Yeah, thank you. It's good to be on here.
Yeah, well, it's really good to meet you. I'm a big fan, really, in your perspective and your expertise. Let's start with, where exactly are we at, in your opinion, with the whole Ukrainian-Russian conflict? Where is that at, and where is that exactly going?
Well, the war on the ground, I think it's been lost. It's lost in every way. I think in NATO we ran out of weapons. The Ukrainians ran out of manpower, and as a result, things are crumbling quite quick on the front line. Now, I know in the media it's often portrayed as if the situation is kind of stable, but they tend to always look at how fast the front lines are actually moving. But again, this is a war of attrition, and I always make the point that this doesn't make much sense to sacrifice a huge amount of troops to make these gains moving forward, if at the end you're going to be bled dry, because in a war of attrition you're more or less fighting to the last man. So we see, therefore, that there's less interest to move forward unless the adversary has been weakened. So in the beginning of a war, you saw the Russians would effectively bomb every village to the ground, being nothing left before they could move forward. These days, you see them falling much, much easier. That is, often many buildings haven't been touched. And this is because once the army begins to weaken on the other side, then it's possible to move forward without taking too many losses. So once the Ukrainian army had been weakened enough, the Russians opened up this front in Kharkov to further stretch out already thin Ukrainian forces. And then, for some reason unknown to me, the Ukrainians, NATO thought it was a good idea to invade the Russian region of Kursk a few months ago. And this even thinned out the troops even further. And it became a trap for the Ukrainians, because they couldn't pull out. Yes, they were stuck in this fire pocket where they wasted a lot of equipment and some of their best men. So now the war has been lost, and it's within this context which we have to understand why the United States is negotiating with Russia. The Europeans appear to be very upset, but in their minds they think this is a choice between a bad deal now or defeating Russia and having a better deal later. But the real alternative here is either a bad deal now or the collapse of the Ukrainian army. So whatever terrible deal the Trump administration is able to negotiate, it's nonetheless the best possible deal, I think, that's possible to be gained.
Yeah. Okay. So let's unpack that. It just seems like, well, let's start with this. Let me ask this. Why was the Western media they didn't come out and say this, and they haven't come out and said this really since the beginning. Why? Why didn't they tell the facts? It just seems like Russia just had their way with Ukraine, if you would.
Well, it's, I know that the West decided to go for a long war. This was already confirmed back in the beginning of 2022, after the Russians invaded. What we learned from statements from Zelensky himself, he said that many countries in the West wanted a long war in Ukraine because this would give them a chance to bleed out the Russians, even if it meant the destruction of Ukraine. We had the two mediators, Israel and Turkey, who confirmed also that, yes, the Russians and Ukrainians were close to a deal based on restoring Ukraine's neutrality, but the UK and US decided to continue and sabotage this so they can, effectively use this to bleed Russia. And as many other reports came out, the goal was then regime change in Moscow. This was seen as the only acceptable outcome. And ever since then, we've had formed narratives based on a long war. And the ultimate and most powerful narrative is that this was unprovoked. Because if it's an unprovoked war, that is, Russia is the new Hitler, or Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union, then in such a situation, peace can only mean to defeat the adversary, while negotiations means appeasement and defeat. So this is why you have the NATO Secretary General saying, or the former now, that weapons are the path to peace, and it's no point talking to the Russians because they just lie and they can't be trusted. This is all the long war narrative. But of course, there's many other smaller narratives, for example, suggesting that the Russians are taking many more casualties than the Ukrainians. This is also to mobilize support from our public to continue the war, because we're saying then, well, the Russians can be defeated if we just give it a little bit more time. And also, the Ukrainians aren't really losing that many men anyways. But if they were told the reality that the Ukrainians are being massacred, and also what our media doesn't want to show, how Ukrainians effectively are hunted on the street to be thrown into vans and shipped off to the front line. If we show this on our TV screens, perhaps our public wouldn't want to support this war anymore. Maybe if we talked about the fact that the majority of Ukrainians want negotiations, then standing with Ukraine in terms of rejecting peace and fighting on doesn't really make any sense. So everything we do is now hardwired for a long war. And I think this is the main problem, because there is no pathway to victory. Whatever victory over the world's largest nuclear power might have looked like, there is simply no path anymore. And I think that's why a key problem now is that I think we got trapped by our own narratives. That is, what are you going to do here in Europe? All our politicians said that this was Hitler. Once it's finished with Ukraine, well, we said two things. That is, Ukraine has to be a part of NATO because Russia would never dare to attack a NATO country. But we're also saying that once Russia's done with Ukraine, they will attack NATO. So it's everything is contradictory. Nothing really makes sense. One day we're saying the Russians are completely backwards, so we have to really be able to fight. The next day they're prepared and capable of conquering all of Europe. So it's all nonsense. It's a bit like listening to Trump. Don't listen to everything exactly what he's saying, but why he's saying it. And I think the same applies to the Europeans at the moment.
Yeah, let's get to the why. And that's what, I don't know if it's confused me, but I find it interesting, is why was this conflict in the first place? It doesn't seem like, we should be involved in any ways other than that there's a financial aspect. It doesn't seem like, it just seems like a great loss of life, and it's just to perpetuate, either the military industrial complex in the West, or just, to be quite frank, some money laundering scheme from politicians, if you would. That seems the why, because it doesn't seem like it should concern us in any way. And why, again, other than just we have to have a villain in all this, why is the Western media painting Russia in such a bad light when it seems like Ukraine? And just to give you a background, I have family in Central and Eastern Europe, and before this whole started, and even to this day, their opinion is that is the most corrupt country, if you're going to take a country in Europe, if you would. So that was their question. Why are we even involved? So, can you answer that if you know what I'm saying?
Well, I think the Ukraine war has many sources behind it, but the main thing is I think it's a symptom of a collapsing world order. Keep in mind that when the Cold War came to an end, the main idea was we're going to create what the Gorbachev had called a common European home. That is an inclusive European security system. Even in 1990, we signed agreements such as the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. The whole thing was based on indivisible security. So one side should not expand its security at the expense of another. We're going to have a Europe without dividing lines, so overcome the bloc politics of the Cold War. However, as we already saw around 94, Russia was getting much weaker. And by the way, that time in early 94, even President Clinton argued that expanding NATO would redivide the continent and recreate the logic and conflicts of the Cold War. So this was very much well known. You see, but then Russia became weaker and weaker, and the main idea was why do we need to take their security into consideration at all? Sorry, because instead this idea came forth that instead let's create not a security system where we have to take into account the security of our opponents, but instead a hegemonic security architecture. There's a Pax Americana or unipolarity, global primacy. A lot of this was built also into the US security strategy at the time. Now, in terms, if you want a system based on global primacy, how that translates into a European security architecture is one of a collective hegemony. Then you have to maintain the alliance systems. If you maintain the alliance systems, then the Europeans will be dependent and Russia will be contained and weakened. So this was more or less the system went forward with. Keep in mind that the US Secretary of Defense, William Perry, he even pointed out back then that this was a huge mistake. He considered quitting the Clinton administration. And he also recognized, everyone in the administration recognized this would provoke conflict with Russia. But nonetheless, the main idea was it doesn't really matter what Russia thinks, they're getting weaker anyways. So why have a security system? We have to take them into consideration. Let's instead go for full dominance. And that meant we'll be so powerful and Russia will be surrounded by NATO anyway. So if it doesn't care for it, well, it doesn't really matter. Now, within this context, the main problem, the ultimate red line, and by the way, these are the words of the former CIA director, William Burns. He said the ultimate red line, the reddest of all red lines, would be Ukraine. And he very correctly predicted that this would trigger a civil war and the Russians would reluctantly invade because this was seen as an existential threat to the Russians. So, and the Europeans knew this all along. I mean, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, once called this that Ukraine and NATO would be seen as a declaration of war. So the unprovoked narrative is just based on, it's false, just playing on the ignorance of people and being able to do so because of a very dishonest media who would just want to play ball rather than actually report on reality. So of course, many countries in Eastern Europe, they were quite happy about this as well because, under the Cold War and even before, Russia has not always been, an angel either. If you live on the border to a great power, you have your sovereignty violated quite often. Of course, this is also true in Central America, but also Russian neighbors. If I lived in Poland or Latvia, I would probably also want to be part of an anti-Russian military bloc. That is, instead of having a Europe without dividing lines, I would want to have the dividing lines moved closer to Russia and rather be on the other side. This is effectively the direction we went. And this is despite the fact we knew this would likely trigger a war. And also, by the way, when we toppled the government in Ukraine to pull Ukraine into our orbit, only about 20% of Ukrainians actually wanted to join NATO. That's another narrative, by the way, the fact that we argue that Ukrainians just wanted to escape the shadow of Russia and join NATO. This was not true until 2024, when we toppled the government, recreated the government, that is who should be in the government. Also from the first day after the coup, began to rebuild the entire Ukrainian intelligence services to have, because the ones who were there before the coup, they were very pro-Russian, liked the Ukrainian population, and then we replaced it with our own, as the New York Times said, or New Washington Post, built up our own Ukrainian intelligence services, which were anti-Russian to the core. So this has been going on for a while, and all the evidence is there. It's just that the media doesn't report on actual facts anymore. It's quite concerning, especially in Europe. At least in the US, you get sometimes articles from the New York Times or Washington Post. In Europe, it's full conformity to the NATO narrative.
Yeah. So that leads me then to where exactly are we now? And that means in March 2025. Is this a complete collapse of obviously you just said it's a complete collapse of Ukraine. How is that going to be sorted out with regards to the US and also the rest of Europe? And where does this leave NATO, if you would?
Well, that's the great question, because NATO, again, was a manifestation of hegemonic era. But as Marco Rubio came out and said, well, the unipolar order was it was an anomaly. It was not meant to last forever. It's not natural forever to have only one center of power in the world. So he said the world is becoming multipolar. We have to adjust to it. They didn't really go that much further into it, but this is quite interesting because, again, the Ukraine war is about cementing unipolarity. So there's an acceptance that this war has been lost, and this begs also the question: what are the calculations coming from Washington, and what kind of policy changes will there be? Because the message you get from the Trump administration is, the war has been lost more or less. The Ukrainians might lose their entire country if they continue. Again, they're on the path to collapse. And also the conflict with Russia doesn't make much sense because at the moment, all it did was push Russia instead of, Biden wanted to break Russia so they could focus on China. Instead, it's Russia's only strengthening and it's aligning itself closer and closer to China. This is, Kissinger's worst nightmare. You don't want this. You want to have a natural balance of dependence or balance of power on this vast Eurasian continent. So instead, they're seeing all the major powers beginning to cooperate to balance the United States, and this is not ideal for the US. So a multipolar world actually makes a lot of sense when it reflects the reality, because if the US continues to try to hold on to unipolarity, you're going to see China, India, Russia, all the major BRICS countries as well collectively balance the US. If it takes a step back and do not insist on global primacy, then these countries will more or less begin to check each other as well. And then this has traditionally been known as America's offshore balancing strategy, and it's a good one. So I think that's the direction they're going. But then it begs the question: what happens to NATO? Because it's a hegemonic institution, and America can't be everywhere anymore. It has to prioritize. He wants to go to the Western Hemisphere. He wants to go to Asia, and as Hegseth suggested, Europe is not really a priority anymore. And so for this reason, when the Americans leave Ukraine, they will probably also, to a large extent, pull out of Europe. And this is why the Europeans are in full panic, because we put all our eggs in the American basket and we didn't diversify. Usually sensible countries in a multipolar system diversify. There are many economic partners, so they have more prosperous economies. They don't become excessively vulnerable. They have more political autonomy. In Europe, we do the opposite. We're just doubling down and trying to convince the Americans that we're still relevant partners by doing everything we're told. So it's but then only becoming less and less relevant because we're not following national interests, becoming more submissive. New alternative poles of power are emerging. So within our countries, by the way, and so this is what's happening. I think with the Americans reducing their presence in Europe. Very predictable things will happen because America's always been kind of the pacifier in Europe. The reason why the Germans, the French, the British don't compete for leadership is because America had the leadership. Now, if America starts to reduce its presence, the Europeans will become less united. All this relentless hatred for Russia is not enough to unite. So I think, America will go where the actual action is. You want to make Russia an economic partner. It wants to be more present in Asia. It wants to strengthen its role along its own borders. A lot of priorities, and Europe's simply not one of them. And the Europeans will begin to turn a little bit more on each other. And it's within this framework, I think NATO, its role is severely diminished. It's no longer an instrument for hegemony. And more and more countries will start to question, well, what do we need? How likely is it that the US would follow Article 5 and come to Europe's defense if it was necessary? And you see already this now. You see the Germans talking about whether or not they need nuclear weapons, at least nuclear sharing. But at the moment, I don't see it happening. I just think at the moment there's a bit of panic because we lived for 80 years, outsourced our security and strategic thinking to the US. And now we're suddenly this 40-year-old son who has to move out of the basement and we're not quite sure exactly what to do. So now I think that's how I would see the future of NATO, which would be that probably won't last, at least in its current form.
Okay, so I was going to ask that question, and you answered it. Do you think the EU and then NATO will just cease to exist? And I guess what you're trying to say is, like, just not in its current form, correctly?
Yeah. Well, the EU, yeah, could have been different. I mean, the benefit of the EU, it would function best as a geo-economic region. That is, you have all these different small to medium-sized countries. I guess some qualify as large, and they all come together for collective bargaining power. So they're able to negotiate, for example, with the United States, more from a position of equality or more symmetry in relations. At least this was the basic idea. Also with the Russians, and anyways, it's but for the nation states within the EU, almost states, if they want to function properly, have to be sovereignty maximized. That is, yes, you transfer some of your governance and sovereignty to the EU as this supranational institution. However, in return, the EU is able to deliver tangible goods to its member states simply because it can negotiate for better deals, better economic, and thus also translated into political influence. So this was the strength of the EU. This is why I used to think the EU was a good idea. Now we see something different. The EU isn't really pursuing its interest anymore. It's become stuck in this idea that its mission was only to be one out of two pillars of the collective West, so the US and EU, which would have this collective hegemony. Now that the US has less relative power in the world and is shifting its priorities away from Europe, the Europeans don't really know what to do, and they kind of subordinated all their interests to this Western project, I think they become more dependent on coercion. I think this began first when the British left the EU, when the EU tried to punish them instead of trying to find a way of keeping them inside. And you see it these days as well, when the Prime Minister of Hungary goes to push for diplomacy. He visited Ukraine and Russia with the respective presidents to see if there was any path to negotiations. The EU responded by punishing him because he said, you're breaking our unity, because we don't talk to Russia. This is the main idea. Diplomacy is bad here because, Putin is Hitler, apparently. So this is kind of the logic. So there's, as the EU becomes less competitive, it also becomes a bit more authoritarian. You might have heard about the presidential election in Romania got annulled. He's not allowed to run anymore. We tried to topple the government in Georgia because the country that is, because it didn't they didn't vote the right way. We supported rigging the election in Moldova. It's no, across the board. It's the EU is going down now the wrong path, I think. So I think they should go back to the fundamentals. That is, make it into an economic club. And the main weakness we have in Europe is, well, first of all, energy is very expensive. So instead of trying to fight Russia, we should try to find some political solution. And second, we don't have, unlike the Americans or Chinese, or lesser extent the Russians, we don't have actually any digital ecosystem. So whenever you talk about industrializing or modernizing the economy, we don't have any of these basic platforms. And we fell behind on what people refer to as the fourth industrial revolution as well. So there's a lot that has to be done, but none of these things entail fighting Russia. And as I keep making an argument all along, Russia's initial security concerns, that is not having an anti-Russian military bloc on its borders, was not unreasonable. These concerns could have been met. It was unnecessary to choose war, and then afterwards, we don't even want to sit down with the Russians and make peace. So it's there's a lot that has to be done, but the politicians here, they are, I'm not sure what they're thinking. They are they're in panic mode and they're just acting out, and it's if you can make sense of it, it doesn't make sense to me. The main idea now seems to be, the Americans don't want to fight anymore. And in the past, we had the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians all fighting Russia. And now that the Americans are pulling away, they're the main military force. Somehow, with the Europeans think they can still fill America's shoes and defeat Russia on the battleground. It's absurd, and it's gonna result only in horror. So, I don't understand the politicians here anymore. I think they abandoned reason a long time ago.
So I had Alex Craner on a handful of times, and I'm sure you know Alex. And one of his points was, you mentioned Germany, getting nuclear weapons, or wanting or questioning if they should have nuclear weapons. His argument was that Germany, the biggest economy in Europe, would probably go east and not west, and actually make amends with Russia. That would make a lot of sense to me, but that's nothing that's been discussed out in the media. What is your opinion on that? Do you think Germany would potentially go east and, yeah, and not really play with its, meaning have the normal trade and uh, relationships with the rest of Europe?
Well, it's hard to say. Again, usually you look at what's the strategic interest of states and you assume that the policymakers will act rationally. But again, I reside in Europe. I'm not seeing any of this. So, but you're correct. I mean, for the Germans, if they would look at their strategic interest, they would seek to have closer cooperation with Russia. That is, most of Germany's industries are quite energy intensive, and their competitive advantage was to link themselves up with cheap and reliable supply of Russian energy. And once they, well, again, liberated themselves from Russian energy, they also liberated their economy from being competitive. And now you see deindustrialization, and this is a problem for all of Europe, by the way, because Germany has kind of been the economic locomotive driving everything forward. And now, yeah, they're doing very poorly, not only deindustrializing, but then yeah, the Chinese can take over some of the industries. The United States also has this Inflation Reduction Act where they offer some subsidies for German industries to move across. So there's the pathway they're on is not sustainable. And of course, if the Germans would align themselves closer with Russia, it doesn't. And I'm not talking about alliance against the West or anything, but just diversify their economy. They would also be it will form a very powerful new center of power in this multipolar system. Again, a divided Europe, redivided and remilitarized, it condemns the Europeans to become excessively dependent on the US, and Russia would be more dependent on China than it otherwise would. If we can overcome the bloc politics, which we never did after the Cold War, we could make Europe without these dividing lines become more prosperous, secure, and also more stable. But no one's moving in this direction. But I think that, historically, the main policy from Britain when they were the dominant maritime power and was to keep the Germans and Russians separated. Because again, if they would cooperate, they could form a very powerful grouping, in worst case alliance, which could threaten Britain. This logic was also applied by the United States. That is, if you're the maritime power operating off the periphery of Europe, you don't want the two main powers of Europe to come too close together. So again, the alliance system, this is what it's supposed to do. You divide into a dependent ally and a weakened adversary. So, but the world has changed. That's my point. That is, in the past, in the 19th century, and all when we try to split the Russians from the Germans and push Russia into Asia, it meant it becoming backward, stagnant, and uncompetitive. This time, and that was the main, by the way, the open objective in the Crimean War in the 1850s. This time, when we push Russia into Asia, it lands in the arms of China, which is, by purchasing power parity, has been the largest economy in the world since 2014 and only continues to strengthen at a very rapid rate. So how good of an idea was this? I mean, China is not Germany. It's Germany on a lot of steroids. This is a very powerful country. And I think this is the price we're paying because we didn't want Russia to be a part of the new Europe. Well, now they're part of a new Eurasian huge grouping. And so I don't think it's in the interest of Germany. And eventually, I don't even think it's in the interest of the United States because do you want the Russians to be able to diversify, not be too dependent on China? So, but
Do
it
you think
remains to be
that's
seen.
Do you think that's why the new Trump administration, it seems like they're reaching a lot out to Russia? Is it just because they're concerned about their relationships, the Russian relationship with China, meaning that they're going to be too close, if you would, and form an alliance that could be, and even an economic alliance that could be detrimental to the U.S. and to the West?
Yeah, no, well, they're quite open about this. They want to prevent or stop Russia drifting so close to China. this is seen as a huge problem. I guess this is exemplified best by Trump's envoy, General Keith Kellogg, because was it 2 years ago? I saw him on a panel where he was making the point that fighting Russia with Ukrainians, he called it the acme of professionalism, because America got to knock out a great power rival, Russia, without using any American troops. So again, using the Ukrainian proxy. And thereafter, after knocking out Russia, the US could focus all its resources on countering China. So I asked him about this as well. I actually tweeted about it, and he replied that, he got this from Sun Tzu pretty much, that this was, some very clever strategy, but it didn't factor in the idea that Russia was able to diversify, and it reduced, and it's done this for a while, by the way. And but now, of course, I saw him. I wasn't there. I saw him on TV. I mean, on the Munich Security conference back in February, and now the argument was slightly different. Now he's saying, well, we've seen something bad. The Russians are getting too close to China, Iran, North Korea. This didn't used to be the way. We have to reach out and, stop them coming together. So effectively the idea of Kissinger, that is, don't go after all your major rivals at the same time, because then you're going to make them ally against you. And this is also, I think, the logic why the US has been moving away from this world order based on global primacy, because once it doesn't reflect the distribution of power, once you actually have a multipolar distribution of power, all it does is to incentivize all your major opponents to ally together. So it's simply not in the US interest. This is what you see. That's what I think the US is also worried about, because the Chinese and the Russians are forming now this core of a new system in which it's not all military alliance. The Chinese don't do military alliances, but you see it in the form of BRICS. It's decoupling from the US in terms of its technologies, its industries, its transportation corridors, its banks, its payment system, insurance systems, also its currency, the drift away from the dollar. This is at least something that Trump is quite concerned about, it seems. So no, it's there's a lot at stake here, and I think this explains why the US is also shifting its position on Ukraine. And again, what's the alternative? If Ukraine collapses, the Russians will just take whatever they want, which is, well, not in the US interest either.
Mhm. So in this scenario here with Russia and China, again, becoming closer in ties and economic ties, as you have stated, as well as the US, if you would, separating itself from Europe. My question really is then, where does Europe get its energy? I mean, I know you have Norway, where you are at, has an incredible amount of oil. Then they have the North Sea in the UK that has a lot of oil, but it's dwindling. But still, there's a lot of people in Europe that's a huge continent. Well, it's a big continent, but it's a huge economic engine, if you would, if you look at it as a collective. But they don't have a whole lot of natural resources, and they don't have any energy except for Norway. So yeah, that's my question is now everything with Nord Stream and all of the cutting ties with Russia for energy. It's just, pardon my French, but it seems like they're screwed just for oil.
No, very much so. I agree with that sentiment. So no, it is going very wrong. It's and you see this with energy prices as well. The access to cheap energy, again, the lifeblood of any industry is gone, and paying many times more for the energy. And this is going to impact the economy. And it's not just oil and gas. It's also, if you go for other resources from Africa, because given we want to fight the Russians in Ukraine, they are squeezing out the French from many African countries as well, where they used to have good energy deals, in which these resources instead end up in the hands more of old Africans. So there's and Russia organizing a lot of this, by the way. So it's Europe is putting itself in a very vulnerable position. So not only are the economies doing more and more poorly, but then the little money that's left, and at the time with high interest rates as well, the idea is that, well, now we have to pour hundreds of billions of euros into arming ourselves to the teeth, because we have to, well, fill America's shoes in terms of containing Russia. The alternative to all of this, that is spending money we don't have to fight Russia, and it would be to accept that we also had a huge blame in terms of starting this war. We helped to provoke it. We helped to sabotage all the peace paths to peace. So, and this is not to submit ourselves to the Russians, but if you accept that there's two sides to the story, then at least we can find a compromise. We can come up with a new settlement. Perhaps we can fix Europe and create a mutually acceptable European security architecture, because we never did that after, as I said, after the Cold War. We just said the Russians are weak. We create a Europe without the Russians, which predictably became a Europe against Russia. And, so let's deal with this. If we fix it, then perhaps we can fix our relations with Russia, because Russia is nothing if not pragmatic. So if we want to have some trade agreements, by energy, to the extent Russia's able to diversify to avoid excessive dependence, for example, on China, or simply to sell more energy to build its wealth, they will go forth with this. So there's a lot of pathways, but again, none of them entail sending troops into Ukraine and going to a war with Russia. It's quite mad, but we need some political maturity in Europe, which there's none of.
Yeah. So I guess the next, if we were to project this out 5 to 10 years, which is we can project, but it's impossible to get exactly right. What does this all look like? Does Germany make an alliance here? Because it seems like that'd be reasonable if they're looking out for the best interest. With Russia, where does the power shift, or the financial center, which would be, I would guess, Germany as well as the UK, even though the UK is not part of the EU, but that's the financial area of Europe. Does that leave? Does that go east, or does that just, who fills that vacuum is what I'm trying to ask.
Well, it remains to be seen, but the question is a good one, because whenever you look in the media here, and listen to the politicians, they always talk about Europe will do this, Europe will do that, and but it's not a united entity. And even now, when you have the EU leadership saying, well, EU will have to tighten its belt for a while, we have to give up on the welfare state, we're going to have to accept less competitive economies because we're going to free ourselves from Russian energy. This is a contradiction, because Europe cannot be united if it stops pursuing its very basic interest. If you're asking everyone to cut themselves off their own national interest, which is to have trade relations with Russia, then you're going to see a lot of countries see the political leadership be weakened. You're going to have new political alternatives popping up both on the left and right, so suggesting, well, what they're already suggesting now, because the center is the radical, which wants more war. On the left and right, you see alternatives popping up, arguing we should make peace with the Russians. So countries will begin to then drift in different directions. Already we can't convince the Hungarians, the Slovakians, increasingly the Italians, to continue on this path. And indeed, we have to back this, well, I would call it suspending democracy in Romania, just because they also seem to be voting for Georgescu, who wanted peace in Ukraine. So there's a huge problem. And for this reason, I think Europe will fragment if it doesn't start looking after its own interest. And indeed, if you want a Europe that looks after its own interest, we have to question some of this idea that is the largest country in Europe by population, territory, resources, military. It's Russia. So perhaps it would be in our interest to find some kind of an economic compromise. But in the absence of it, it's hard to say. Everyone has their own push for how to be relevant. The Germans, they saw economics as being it, because when they expanded the EU and all, they became more of the center. They also benefited more from this because of the Deutschmark versus the euro. The French, they believe that if we militarize the EU, then the leadership will go from the Germans to the French, because they are more of a military power, they're a nuclear power. Meanwhile, the UK, which is also a military power but not part of the EU, it sees more of its, claim to glory to be the junior partner of the United States, which is why I have, whenever Starmer is in Washington, or any British prime minister talk about this, great close partnership and how it's the strongest partnership in the history of humanity. And, oh, you can come visit our king one more time. All of this, so they all have the different path to staying relevant. But there will also be other countries, be it Hungary and also, like I said, likely in the future, Italy as well. They will see it through their interest to link themselves closer with Russia. And that's where I think you and your friend Alex Kreiner, who's quite an excellent guy, makes the point that Germany's claim to greatness would be its economy, and its economy can't function without Russia. So at some point, it will bring forth the political forces to begin to gravitate a bit closer to Russia. So I think this will be a positive thing, but we should make it in an alliance systems. There's no Germany working with Russia doesn't mean it has to go against the French, for example. So
Yeah.
I think, this is what we should discuss in Europe, but we're not, by the way.
Yeah. So it sounds like, again, and I guess we'll wrap this up with, I just want to paraphrase, you see things getting more and more fragmented potentially. But that could potentially also be a very good thing if it's an economic alliance, if you would. Being trading with Russia, taking Russian energy is not a negative. If Italy were to do that, or Germany would do that, or whatever, as long as, just comment about that one more time.
No, I agree. Well, at the moment, the consensus among the political establishment is, we'll fight in Ukraine till the last Ukrainian and to the last euro. We're not forming the right economic partnerships, or even isolating ourselves from other parts of the world, even China, which I think is a mistake. So at this point, I think the consensus is quite dangerous, because none of this consensus is making any sense. So I think a bit more fragmentation, because a lot of this consensus is formed around very flawed narratives. So I think, it's some fragmentation would perhaps allow some of these dangerous narratives to break down, bring in some intellectual pluralism, and also I don't think this concentration of power in Europe has been a great idea. It hasn't been beneficial for the economy, not for security, not for political relevance either. So I think there's a need to shift away from this path, but ideally, something could be saved from the former European, that is the EU partnership, because there is something to this idea of collective bargaining power. It's just this obsession with federalizing a federal EU that is making the EU into a great state, just concentrating power continuously when it doesn't make sense. I think this is very, very, very problematic, and that's something the Americans have. Especially J.D. Vance has commented on as well, like, well, what are we doing in Europe now? We're abandoning some of the key values. And a lot of this was predicted, by the way, over 60 years ago in Britain. There's an academic there I liked, probably no longer with us, David Mitrany, and he was making a point. The European integration can follow two different paths. It can be what he called to be federalism, where just concentrate or centralize power for the sake of centralizing, but he argued this would reduce economic competitiveness, security, and good governance. And then he contrasted it with functionalism, which is that the form should follow function. In other words, when does it make sense to get closer cooperation? When does it make sense for economics, for the security, and for also governance? And if it doesn't make sense, then we shouldn't do it. Well, I think this functionalism would be good, but we do federalism in Europe, which is, well, if we concentrate power here, is it good for governance? Is it good for democracy? It's like, no, but, well, we have to make this EU state, so let's do it anyways. Is it good for the economy? No, but we have to do it. And at some point, the thing begins to unravel. So I think, we need to really reassess some of the things we've done, but there's a whole political class who's grown up under this, unipolar moment, believing that the perpetual dominance of the West would allow us to transcend history, would be perpetual peace. It's very difficult to change course now. So I think we're still in the shock mode here, that many people think that, oh, maybe this is just Trump, but keep in mind that already under Obama did the US start to speak about the need to pivot to Asia. So it's just that Trump is more, let's call him honest in his language, or or brutal, or your course, whatever you want, irrespective of the language you choose. The US will shift the international distribution of power, that is the bipolar system under the Cold War and the unipolar afterwards. It created very unique conditions for Europe and the United States to have very overlapping interests. But this time is over. There's multipolarity, and our interest will be more divergent. And again, by all means, I think we should have as close relationship with the US as possible. But this immaturity, that we're believing that our interest will always be exactly the same, given that we're allies, this is very dangerous. It's something that polluted the minds of many of our politicians. So, yeah, no, again, I think we have a lot in common with the US. I think we're preserving some political idea of a political West. I think this can all be good, but no, there has to be some reality and national interest involved as well.
Yeah. Glenn, very well said. And I would actually agree with everything that you just said. Very well said. I'm a fan of your work and of listening to you and watching your interviews. If people want to do that, follow you, listen to you, how about do they go doing that?
Well, all my articles and podcasts and interviews, everything goes on my Substack, but I also have my own YouTube channel. I'm on the Duran, but I also have my own, just under my name, Glen Diesen, and I'm also on Twitter, where I just tend to, videos, where everything goes. So yeah, go Substack, Twitter, or my YouTube channel. That would be great.
I will, excuse me, I'll link to all of that in the show notes on the YouTube channel, my YouTube channel here, as well as on my Apple Podcast and Spotify podcast. Glenn, I want to thank you so much for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Would love to have you on again soon.
Oh, sure. Anytime, Andy. I appreciate it.
Take care.